Hello everyone, Sultan here to talk through the recent Hellscube 9 Veto Council application. Just gonna read through this and tell you sort of what the Veto Council, the Cabal, the Colossal Dreadmaw with a gun pointed at my head was looking for during this last Veto Council search. So just to get started, it's the Hellscube 9 Veto Council application. Feel free, by the way, to go ahead and try this on your own. The link is still active. We won't be reviewing them at this point, but you're welcome to look at it and try to answer the questions and see how you do, and use this as sort of a practice for any future Veto Council applications or just to make yourself a better card designer. That in mind, we'll go ahead and read through this brief blurb before we start. So, evaluate cards as though you were on the Veto Council. You are not responsible for caring about slots. As a member of Veto Council, you are responsible for playability. Keep in mind that cards need to be playable both online and in person as much as possible. Balance. Hellscube 9 is Vintage Cube power level. And rules adherence. Some of this is done with the help of our fantastic Hells judges, but usually the Veto Council, if they can see it and call it out and maybe then ask the judges, that helps things go a lot better than if the judges have to notice it themselves. Not all require a thesis of analysis. We want your thoughts on why you would either vote to approve, ask for an errata, or vote to veto each card. And then please keep in mind that there aren't always firm correct answers, and that's true. Some of what I say will be sort of up for debate, and I'll try to preface that with, this is my opinion, or something like that. Whereas other things are pretty hard and fast. Sometimes there are correct answers, but not always, and that's important. Sometimes a card doesn't function as written. There may be an intended correct answer, but it's not always that simple. There'll be times where you have a dissenting opinion from other Veto Council members, and your responsibility would then be to explain why you disagree. So you don't need to try and find the absolute 100% of the time correct answer. You just need to explain why you think what you think, and any answer is better than no answer. And then it's okay not to know things. Not all users need to have the comprehensive rules memorized and understood from top to bottom. I can tell you that I certainly don't. If you're unsure of something, explain what you're unsure of, what your recourse would be when you're given the answer. And you can say sort of like, okay, if this is the case, then I would say this, and if it's actually this, then I would say this other thing. And it's okay to say, I think the existing Hellscube card, this one, makes rules nonsense happen. There's no strict rule for it, but here's what I'd say if X is the result or if Y is the result, sort of what I was saying. So then we ask for your Discord username. That is so that we can give you the correct perms if you do make it that far. And then bam, straight in there with the first card. So this is Bitching Fries. It is, for 1 white mana, a legendary creature, dog, bad guy. When Bitching Fries enters, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. At the beginning of each end step, Bitching Fries' base power becomes equal to the highest value its power reached that turn. The same is true for its toughness. And then it's got the star power and toughness. And so you can vote to approve, veto, errata, or not sure. So this one is definitely not an approve, because as written, it enters as a star, which is essentially a 0/0, and then immediately dies to state-based actions before it can get that 1/1. And so you can have it. It would be best if this said, as it enters, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn, because then it will be a 1/1, and then at the end of the turn, it will presumably become a 2/2. But there is also some ambiguity here about the same is true for its toughness. That means its toughness becomes equal to the highest value its power reached that turn, or its base toughness becomes the highest value its toughness reached that turn. So there's also some confusion there. And so this would definitely probably be an errata vote. As far as power level goes, this by itself is just a 1/1. And then if you manage to put a counter on it or an equipment on it or something like that, it will continue to grow exponentially. Something to be aware of there is if the power and toughness get offset, maybe you have an equipment or an aura that gives +1/+0, that might, or like +2/+1, that might start to become a tracking issue, so that's something to think about. But this card is probably fine. It relies on other cards to make it stronger, so that would get an errata vote, and I've just explained my reasoning to all here, so I'm not going to type all that out, but you can sort of extrapolate the important things there. Next up, we have Destiny Draw, which is a Yu-Gi-Oh card with the word conspiracy slapped on it. If you use 10 or more LP, you can activate this skill during your next draw phase. During your draw phase, you may search your deck for any card, reveal it to your opponent, and add it to your hand instead of drawing. If you do that, flip this card over. So this is asking specifically, saying it has been accepted into Hellscube 9.0, so it's been voted in. It's now at the Veto Council. One of your fellow counselors is arguing that the card is too strong, as it lets you cast Demonic Tutor for free during the game. Another of your fellow counselors is arguing that the card is too weak, as it only triggers once you lose 10 or more LP. And there may be some games where that doesn't ever happen. So what do you say to change one or both of their minds? So this is sort of, we ask a couple of questions in this way to sort of frame you of, you are part of a team, you are dealing with people who don't necessarily agree, either with you or with each other. And so what do you think what would you say here? And so the most important thing is when we look at this card, is it's a little bit ambiguous, because it says if you lose 10 or more LP, which we're assuming is life, you can activate the skill during your next draw phase. Does that mean if you lose 10 or more at once, or just over the course of the game, or is that if your life drops below 10? Because those are all three different things. So this card is a little bit ambiguous. But ultimately, we decided that this card doesn't feel great, because and this was sort of operating under the assumption that it was when you get below 10. At least that's how I was interpreting it. But like the idea was this card is not worded great, and so there's a lot of ambiguity there. And so with that ambiguity, there's a lot of different, like, okay, well, if it's this version, then casting the Demonic Tutor is fine if you lose 10 life all at once, because you're probably losing the game at that point. You've just taken a bunch of damage. But also maybe not, because maybe you've got something like a Necropotence or something on the field and you just drew a bunch of cards and now you're drawing one more card, the perfect card. And so I think really you can say, well, this card either does nothing or it does quite a lot for you to sort of help turn the tides. And so it's probably not a great fit here, especially if people can't really agree on if it's too strong or too weak, and we don't like it. And so that sort of, this is one where in real life the Veto Council would talk it out and then a prevailing opinion would come out. But here we sort of wanted to get your opinion. And so this one's a little bit more up in the air. This is one of those where there's not really a perfect answer. But we wanted to see sort of which of those things that I mentioned that you thought about, or if that you caught, that losing 10 or more LP could be a couple of different things. Next up we have Golden Fetty, which is 3 black for a creature bear. It's a 2/2. And for a black mana, Fetty is all colors until end of turn. And it says here, Golden Fetty has been accepted into Hellscube 9.0, is now in Veto Council. The other members of the Veto Council team think that this card should do more to be at a vintage power level. Specifically, they would like to include, when Golden Fetty attacks, free cast a copy of Jump Scare for each color he is. What are your thoughts? And so, first thing I will say is this card absolutely is too weak to be at vintage power level, because it's a 5 mana 2/2 with a ability that currently does nothing. And if we want to look and see what Jump Scare does, that is a instant that until end of turn, target creature gets +2/+2, gains flying, and becomes a horror enchantment creature in addition to its other types. Boo! So that would change this card significantly. And so what we want you to say here is basically like, yeah, this card is too weak for vintage, but the change that you've asked, that we think we're going for here with getting to cast 5 to 6 copies of Jump Scare every turn for 1 mana, is a wild departure from this card as it was submitted. And so this one is a pretty open and shut case of, look, that's not really how Veto Council likes to do things. We don't love making huge changes to cards, especially ones that have no real basis in the card itself. They're not part of the joke. They're not just fiddling with numbers or effects. It's going a whole, like, adding a brand new effect that no one has ever seen before, no one had a chance to vote on. And so really here we just wanted to see, yeah, that's not okay to change the joke that much, change the card that much. And so we would have to veto it, and then the card creator would have to resubmit it with that card text, and it would have to get voted in again. And so that process is sort of just the willingness to kill this card and make sure that that's okay. Next up, we have Repossess, a sorcery for 2 and a blue with buyback 5, and each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7 cards. Exile Repossess. So, and this is just, again, approved, veto, errata, or not sure. And so when we look at this, the first thing that you can see is that this is a blue card, but it's got a completely red frame. And so it's not necessary, but it sure would be nice if anything, even just like a little bit of the top right corner was also blue to sort of indicate to drafters, like, no, this is a blue card, you should look at me. Because in Hellscube drafting especially, it's a bunch of people looking at cards they either don't see that often or probably are looking at for the very first time. They're probably reading most of the cards, and once you are sort of set in your colors, you stop reading the cards that aren't in your colors for the most part, because you don't really want to have to expend that extra mental energy. So doing something to indicate, hey, this is actually a blue card, is really helpful for the drafters. The other thing is that technically the way buyback works is it's when it's put into the graveyard after resolving, and because as a part of resolving this card exiled itself, the buyback doesn't actually work as written. You can sort of imply, like, oh, it works, and you can even say, like, just put parentheses here and say it works. But both of those would be something that would make me say errata. As far as power level goes, the power level on this is fine. It's Time Twister with buyback 5. So it's really not that strong. Time Twister, while part of the Power 9, is notably the weakest of the Power 9, and many people barely consider it power. There are certainly a lot of cards in a Vintage Cube draft I would take over a Pack 1 Time Twister, including a Soul Ring or a Mana Vault or something like that. But that's this card. The next up is Dork Alley, which is a land that taps to create an Elves of Deep Shadow token with haste, and then sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step unless you pay 3. So once again, Elves of Deep Shadow. Is a green 1-mana creature that taps to add a black and deal 1 damage to you. So the first thing is, yeah, that doesn't say that anywhere on the card, and so that would be nice. Veto Council is mostly moving towards the idea of, if it's not exactly obvious what the card does, then it should say on the, like, if it summons a token, then it should say what the token does, or if it conjures a card, it should show what the conjured card is. This is especially good for people who are playing in paper, who then don't need to rifle through a box of tokens to figure out what Elves of Deep Shadow does. If you just, there's some space like up here you could put it, or you could put it down here. But in addition to that slight change, I would also say that this card is incredibly strong because it also can tap to make jump blockers. So it's basically a Mazavith, and then also you can pay 3 mana to ramp it, so it starts paying for itself after a few turns. And so, or to keep the ramp, essentially. And yes, the elves do ping you, but again, that's only if you tap them for mana. So again, you could save them and attack with them, or you can chump block with them or whatever. So there are a couple of different lines of text that we could put on this card to sort of fix that. We could say activate only as a sorcery. We could say that the tokens can't block. We could do a couple of things like that, and that would bring this card more in line with the power level we're looking at, because lands are especially strong and not nearly as interactable as most other things in Magic, and so it's super important that we sort of check the power on the lands and make sure that they aren't crazy. So that is another one that we could errata. Here we have Magus of the Misleading. It is 1 and a blue mana. It is also a green card, though, for a snow instant, and the subtypes are wizard and creature. It has haste and flash, and then the reminder text says you may cast the spell only anytime you could cast a sorcery, which is not what either of those two keywords mean. And then it says draw 2 cards, and then in the reminder text says don't do this, draw 3 cards and discard 1 instead. And then it says treat reminder text on this card as though it were flavor text, and then the reminder text says ignore that. And then it has a power and toughness box, but it just says nope, because again, the creature is in the subtype box. So overall, this card, and it's got the artifact frame and the red card frame, and this whole thing is, as it says, misleading. And so this one is probably a veto. You would, because we need to know what the card does, right? And so my understanding of the card is that it's a 2 mana instant that says draw 2 cards, but it says a bunch of other things on it too that are all kind of contradictory. And so reading the card is supposed to explain the card in Magic, and in Hellscube that's mostly still the case, and this is intentionally trying to mislead you, and so that's really, it makes for a confusing draft experience, it makes for a confusing gameplay experience. And so, yeah, it's funny, but it's not really that playable, so we would be probably cutting that. Next up we have Salt Elemental. It is for 1 red mana, it is a creature elemental with haste and the ability Salt Rage. If you've lost a game this match, Salt Elemental gets +2/+2, has trample, and attacks each combat if able. So it starts as a 1/1, but then if you've lost a game, then the match, it becomes a 3/3 with trample that attacks each combat if able. And so the Veto Council is debating on whether or not this card is acceptable. Some counselors believe that the card is too strong in games 2 or 3, especially on the early turns of the game. Others believe that the card is too weak for Vintage Cube because in game 1 or maybe game 2, it's still just a 1/1 with haste. The only thing that anyone can agree on is that no one can agree what to do. What argument would you make to convince the council of either an effective errata or a veto of this card? So the big thing here is that we've presented 2 scenarios which are both true. This card is not very strong in game 1, it's a 1/1 with haste. But in game 3, it is a 3/3 with haste and trample. And so that's a 1 mana 3/3 with haste and trample is ridiculous and is not okay. And a 1 mana 1/1 with haste isn't great. And so something else this card really encourages you to do is to put it in your sideboard and then only pull it out if it's active. And so that's not great. And so I would probably argue for either errataing the card to sort of neuter some of the abilities and make it a lot less strong in game 3, but also buff it up a little and make it slightly stronger in game 1. But also, the other thing is, if nobody can agree what to do, at some point you've got to just say, that's it, we can't agree on this card is getting vetoed. And so any sort of explanation along those lines is sort of what we're looking for. There's a lot of different options. This question is very open-ended on purpose. So that's what we're looking for with a card like that. Next up, we have Designation Delegate, which is a 6-mana artifact creature advisor construct. It says, start your engines, haunt. When this creature enters or the creature it haunts dies, the ring tempts you. Whenever your ring bearer attacks, if it's night, you take the initiative, otherwise it becomes night. And then if you have max speed, you can tap it to become the monarch. And then it's a 6/6. And then this one, we ask you to explain your reasoning as if you were talking to the creator of the card. So this is important. Veto Council, the application is very interesting because it's not too much like the actual Veto Council experience in terms of the explaining, like the cards. Usually you'll see a higher quality of cards. Hellscube users are very good at making high quality cards. Some of these cards are intentionally low quality to sort of gauge your reaction to it. But a card like this definitely seems like something that could get through submissions. But it is absolutely a card that you'd have to veto because let's start by counting the number of mechanics on this card. Start your engines, haunt, the ring tempts you, the initiative, day-night, monarch. So that's 6 mechanics. all with considerable amounts of reminder text. A couple of those have their own reminder cards. I think the Ring and the Initiative both do. I think Day Night technically does too, but that one's... Yeah, so like... It's introducing a bunch of tracking and game pieces and other things that really you don't want... No one wants to have to deal with, no one wants to have to evaluate, especially in draft, where you're sort of looking at this pack. This is one card among 15 cards in a pack, and you're going to be looking at a whole bunch of packs. And so this just introduces too high of a mental load for players and drafters. But it is very funny, and it will look great in Hellscube Veto, the set. Yeah, and so again, we want you to explain it the way you're talking to the creator. And so, you know, in your head, you can think, oh, this card isn't very good, or oh, this card is a little strong. And even you can think that cards aren't funny. You're not, as a veto counselor, really allowed to interact with how funny the card is, aside from making sure that you don't change the joke too much with your edits. But when you say it sort of essentially out loud to the creator of the card, because every conversation that the veto council has is a conversation between themselves and the creator of the card. And so we want to make sure that you can be nice to people, essentially, is sort of part of it, and also communicate your ideas in a clear and respectful way. Next up, we have Narcomebalus Prime, which is a Kindred Land Nebula Illusion. It's a nebula, so it taps for purple, and then it says when this card is put into your library from anywhere, you may put it onto the battlefield, and then it has Need for 1 and a purple. Need is an old Hellscube 1 mechanic that basically says when you pay the need cost, you put the card from your sideboard on top of your deck. And so there's a couple of things about this card. First of all, it has the Draft Matters frame and watermark, and normally interesting templating like this the veto council doesn't really mess with, but usually the Draft Matters stuff sort of has a mechanical meaning. It means, hey, pay attention to this while you're drafting. And so this card doesn't actually do anything while it's drafting, so that might be something that you would want to change. And then my personal opinion is that this is too strong, because the combination of Need with the ability of when it goes into your library from anywhere, you can put it onto the battlefield, means that it's essentially purple rampant growth in your sideboard. It's basically an 8th card that you have access to, which I don't love. It's sort of the reason why Companion was nerfed in Ikoria, and it's the reason I think this is too strong. Some people suggest bumping up the need cost. Something else you can think about too is that, you know, there's some weird wacky, you could do some weird wacky brainstorm shenanigans to put this from your hand into your library, and then you can put it back, but you never actually have to reveal it, and it's not like, it should be a replacement effect instead of putting it onto the battlefield from your library. It should say, instead of doing that, it should go out into the battlefield. And so this card at the very least would be an errata. I don't love the idea of an 8th card, at least for this cheap, so personally I would be inclined to maybe vote veto, but this would at least be an errata. And again, we ask you to do this as you're talking to the creator of the card. Next up, we have Leadbent Chrononaut, put lead in your breakfast. So Leadbent Chrononaut is a human creature for 1 and a black. It's a 2/1, and it says whenever this creature enters from exile, prepare it. Whenever this creature dies or is put into exile, warp it. And then it's got an adventure, put lead in your breakfast for 1 black mana. It is a state-based spell. It says your opponents each lost 1 life at the beginning of their last end step. So this card, and we just ask the standard approved veto or I'm not sure. This card is very unclear how it works. So what is a state-based spell? We don't know. What does it mean to warp it from exile or from the graveyard? I would assume that that means that you then exile it and then you can cast it from exile for its mana cost. There's kind of a weird loop you can do where it's when it enters from exile, you can prepare it, and then you can cast the spell, and then it you eventually find a way to die, for it to die or to kill it or exile it, and then it gets warped, and so it goes back into exile, and then you can cast it again, and it'll re-prepare it. And that's a very slow loop, but the biggest thing is that it's not very intuitive, and so in real life, not in the context of this form, but in actual veto council, we would say, okay, how does this work? Please explain. And then we'd probably iron some things out. The state-based spell would probably just become an instant or a sorcery or whatever the intent was there. Or potentially we just say, this is too confusing, I don't understand how it works, after it's been explained, and I'd like to veto it. But I think the veto council usually approaches things from a how can we make this work angle, and then sometimes you figure out that, oh, we can't make this work. And so this would at the very least be an errata and potentially be a veto. Yeah, so that's that one. And then we have Evil Filigree Attendant. So this is for 2 and a blue. It's an artifact creature homunculus with a flying, and then at the beginning of each upkeep, target creature gets -X, -O until end of turn, where X is the number of artifacts you control, and it's a 1/3. So this card is a little bit underpowered, actually. It could probably afford to be 2 mana, and then something else is that it says each upkeep target creature, so on your turn, if this is your only creature, it does give itself down to 0 power. So that could be changed to up to X, or not up to, sorry, up to 1 target creature gets -X, -O. And then some people think that, oh, it says evil, it should have the big red flaming text, but that's not actually a call that the veto council gets to make. The card has been through submissions, though you could certainly say, hey, did you mean for it to be flaming red evil text? And at that point, you know, that's a visual errata, so that's kind of okay. But yeah, this card mostly, it's a fairly decent effect. It just needs to be buffed a little. So that would be an errata vote. Next up we have Sarek Aldebrant. So this guy is a, for 1 and a white, legendary creature human. Equipments attached to Sarek get +1, which is +1 to all numbers on them. When Sarek enters, he gets a sword with equip 2 that gives +1/+1 and vigilance. Obviously this card is not formatted super great. As veto council, that doesn't really matter. The only changes that veto council would really want to see here is you might italicize the reminder text. That probably should happen. And then there's a precedent in Hellscube of equipments getting +1. That doesn't usually increase cost, but this says all numbers on them, so that might be a question that you ask the card's creator. And then the biggest thing here is the equip 2. That should be the 2 mana pip probably. And then the other thing is he gets. What does that mean? Does that mean we create a token? Does that mean we create a token and attach it to him? So that's it. There's some other templating stuff which judges or veto council might say, hey, if we're already making changes, would you want to make these changes? And the card is made in Cardsmith, which Hellscube as a whole doesn't like, but again, that's not something that the veto council really should be controlling for or looking for, so that's not an issue. But it's just really those 3 minor issues that we talked about. But those would be an errata. Next up, we have the critically acclaimed MMORPG, which is a 0 mana white enchantment, legendary enchantment saga trial. And then it's got the text free trial for a white. This permanent loses the type trial until end of turn. And then it's got a Realm Reborn, create 2 1/1 hero tokens. If this is a trial, create only 1 instead. And then chapters 2 and 3 are Heavensward and Stormblood. Target creature you control explores. If this is a trial, create a tapped map token instead. And then chapter 4, level 70. This saga gains at the beginning of your upkeep. If this is a trial, sacrifice it, and then remove all lore counters from this. So there's a couple of things about this one. It is really wordy, which isn't a huge issue. It's a lot to read, and there are a few changes you can make to the templating to make it slightly shorter. One of the things that we noticed with applicants this time around is they didn't quite understand the card fully. I think some of them missed that this was chapters 2 and 3. They thought it only made one map. From a balance perspective, this is a Memnite with upside. It's a Memnite that then creates 2 maps and then dies, which is probably fine. It's very slow. You can put more mana into it to either make more guys or to explore immediately. And then it was also pointed out that potentially the last chapter ability, removing all the lore counters, it would still get sacrificed after that, and so there might need to be like an it works sort of assumed or something like that, which if we're making other changes, like I believe the way that this is templating the instead isn't quite how Magic would do it, so if you're already making changes, you could potentially make a few more wording changes in order to make sure that it doesn't immediately sacrifice itself after the last chapter when all the lore counters get removed. This is theoretically infinite value for a white mana, but personally I think it's so slow that it's probably fine. But there were definitely some mixed opinions about this one. But I personally would approve this. And maybe I'd errata the text and all that. I'd make sure that it worked with the chapter 4, but I would be ready to approve it. Next up, we have Aroma Strategy, which is a conspiracy that says you may look at the top card of your deck at any time. This is mostly fine. This is about the right power level for a conspiracy. The only thing that really needs to be there is it needs to say not during mulligans and not when shuffling your deck, because otherwise every fetch land becomes a tutor for the best card in your deck. And same thing with mulliganing, you can just sort of keep shuffling until your best card is on top. So it should specify those. Those might sort of be implied to already be the case, but Magic players are a crafty bunch, and you should make sure that it's easy for them to not cheat. So this one would be a slight errata, but otherwise pretty good to go. Next up we have Wandering Threes, which is just a 1-mana creature spirit, 3/3 for blue. And I'll tell you what, this card is not okay. This card is a veto. Because for 1 mana, having a 3/3, yeah, that's a strong attacker, but it's a really strong blocker, and it invalidates most 1 and a lot of 2 drops as well, which is not ideal, not what we want. A card like Dragon's Rage Channeler, which becomes a 3/3 if you have Delirium, isn't on turn 1 of the game normally, and so that's why something like that is okay, whereas this is not great. And the reason it's a veto and not an errata is because there's not a whole lot you can do to change this without severely impacting the joke. Wandering Threes is a bit on Wandering Ones, which is a 1-mana 1/1 from Kamigawa block, and so there's 3 of them, and so it's a 1-mana 3/3, and that there's nothing there that you can change, and so this is unfortunately a veto. And then the last card we have here, I believe, yes, the last card we have here is Delusional Primordial, which is 5 blue for a creature avatar with flying, and when Delusional Primordial enters the battlefield, if there is no god, Delusional Primordial perpetually gains Indestructible and Vigilance and can and does attack each player's combat. Your opponents can't cast non-creature spells, and it's a 5/5. So the problem here, and we're just going to assume that if there is no god is talking about the creature type, the problem here is that this is a big bomb, and you're thinking, oh, for 7 mana, surely I can win the game by attacking every combat with flying and vigilance and indestructible, and my opponent can't cast non-creature spells. But what happens when you play this with a show and tell, and it's turn 3 and this is on the board? What happens when this gets cheated out or reanimated or something, and it's turn 3 and there's a 2-turn clock on the board now that completely shuts down your opponent? So that's not okay. So you would probably have to cut the indestructible, maybe cut the vigilance, maybe say your opponent can't cast non-creature spells on your turn. But definitely this combination of indestructible and shutting down your opponent's most of their interaction completely is absolutely not okay at any mana value, because you think, oh, a 7-mana card should be able to end the game, but it shouldn't be ending the game on turn 4. So that's that one. So that would need a pretty hefty errata to be allowable, I think. Next up, we ask what your experience is with Vintage Cube. Obviously, there's not a right answer here. It's just you telling the truth. And this is sort of this and the next couple of questions are sort of to see, we are making a Vintage Cube. We want to know what your experience is with Vintage Cube so that you know sort of the power level and the balance that we're going for. And these are essentially open note tests, so you are more than welcome to go onto Scryfall during the exam, like I did, or the application, sorry, like I did, to sort of look up what Jumpscare does and look up what Elves of Deep Shadow does. Or you're also totally welcome to go to Cube Cobra and open up LSV's Vintage Cube or the MTG Online Vintage Cube or whatever you want to look at that, because if you're on Veto Council, we would expect you to use all of the resources that you have available to you to be the best Veto Counselor. And so, absolutely, you should be looking at all that. And if you were looking at all that, this next card, we ask if Delver of Secrets would be a good fit in Vintage Cube. And so if you go to the MTGO Vintage Cube and you look and you say, oh, there is no Delver of Secrets in that Vintage Cube, we still ask you why, so you have to know why. And the answer is for something like Delver, which is a 1-mana, 1/1 creature human wizard for blue that says at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. You may reveal that card. If an instant or sorcery card is revealed this way, transform Delver of Secrets, and that transforms into a 3/2 flying creature human insect. So very strong card in Pauper, but unfortunately not a good fit for Vintage Cube, just because you have to set your deck up in a certain way, and it's really inconsistent and hard to do that, especially in a singleton format like Cube usually is. So Delver of Secrets is most of the time a 1/1, and maybe sometimes it turns into a 3/2 flyer, but most of the time it's just a 1/1, and so that's not really good enough for Vintage Cube. Parallax Wave, on the other hand, Parallax Wave is a 2/white for an enchantment with fading 5. And you can remove a fade counter from Parallax Wave to exile target creature, and then when it leaves the battlefield, each player returns to the battlefield all cards that they own exiled with Parallax Wave. So would this be a good fit in a Vintage Cube, or why not? And again, if you go to the MTGO Vintage Cube, you see that this card is in it. This card is a good card for Vintage Cube, and that's just because it's so versatile. You can use it to blink a bunch of your stuff. Granted, it comes back on your upkeep if you do 5 of them. But you can also use this to remove a big threat for a long time, or you can use this to remove wall of blockers for a turn, or anything of the sort. Any mixed match combo of those effects, and so this card is incredible, and certainly a good fit in Vintage Cube. Lastly, we ask if there's anything else you want to say. You don't have to fill this out. A lot of people just put something silly, or they say thank you. Or if there are any scheduling concerns that they have, they might put those. And then the big thing is at the end, I acknowledge that if I'm selected for Veto Council, I will be expected to help evaluate more than 400 cards over the lifetime, which at this point, Cube half lifetime is estimated at about 2 months of Hellscube 9.0. I expect to be able to perform these duties in a timely manner and inform my fellow Veto Counselors if I will be taking a leave of absence. So all this is basically saying, hey, I know what I'm signing up for, I want to help out. If I am going to be gone for a while, I'm going to let people know ahead of time. And this bit, the 400 cards over the lifetime of the Cube, that's just to let people know sort of how much work that they might be signing up for. In my experience, Veto Council was 2 to 3 hours of work per week. you could definitely do it split up into little 5-10 minute bursts, or you could sit down and do it all at once. Um, and you can be slightly more or less active than that if you want. So really that's up to you, but it's just sort of to give people an idea of the amount of work that it is. And then you can check yes, and then you can press submit, but I'm in preview mode, so I cannot. But yeah, so that is a look at the Hellscube 9 Veto Council application. Hopefully this will help you either with future Veto Council applications, or help you balancing your cards, or just knowing what generally that we're looking for. And that's it. So happy scubing, everybody.